Well, yeah, I am a Gallego living in Miami, but I think that every Spaniard who lives in Miami is called a Gallego anyway. So anyway, thanks for having me. Thanks for the organization for inviting me here today. Yes, I'm going to talk about how charts lie. And first of all, I would like to define what I mean by a chart, because graphs are charts, and maps are charts, and infographics are charts. Any sort of visual representation that is intended to summarize complexity or to explain what would be unexplainable otherwise, as long as it is formatted in visual format, I call it a chart. And the book is titled How Charts Lie, but it's actually more a manual on how to read charts correctly, how to become a better reader of these kinds of visual products that we see every day in news media and in social media and so on and so forth. A little bit of housekeeping before I get started with the talk itself. The slides are not copyrighted, and during the previous talk, I saw many of you taking photographs of the slides. You don't need to do that with this talk, because right after I finish talking, I have a tweet prepared with a link to the slides, to a Dropbox folder that contains the slides in PDF format. These slides are not copyrighted, therefore, if you want to use them in your workplaces, with friends, family, if you think that the concepts that I will be explaining here today are useful for your own work or for your own purposes, feel free to reuse this slide deck at will. Anyway, so charts are becoming very popular and very, very visible in news media, in social media, in many different realms of knowledge. So if we take a look, for example, at the world that I come from, the world of news media, I am a journalist by training, there has been an increase in the use of charts in the past 10 or 15 years, a substantial increase, particularly data visualizations, visual displays of quantitative information. And if you think about, the usual suspects in the United States, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and so on and so forth, in the past decade or decade and a half, they have increased their use of data visualization in particular. And the reason why they do that is that they have seen through their analytics that people really like charts. Whenever you put a chart, whenever you put a map, a graph, a visualization, whatever kind of visual representation of information into a story or into a blog posting or into a social media posting or whatever, engagement with that piece of content increases significantly. People really like to see charts. But do they understand those charts? That's a completely different story. One of the reasons why I wrote How Charts Lie is that in the past few years I have been observing, both informally and also scientifically, how people read charts. And I have started identifying an increasing problem, what we could call an epistemic gap. In the past 10 or 20 years, the technologies that are used to process data, to visualize data, to manipulate data, have increased in complexity, in richness, and in sophistication. And the people who use those things, we could call you an elite. You are over here, right? If you're attending this presentation, it's probably because you are over there. But I don't care that much about you. Right? I care about the people over here, people like me, people who don't have any sort of formal training on statistics or in data science, in IT, or even in data visualization. This epistemic gap in the past decade or decade and a half, in my opinion, has increased. Because in the past few years, we have seen the development of many new technologies, right? Think about, for example, virtual reality, mixed reality, or new technologies and techniques and tools to manipulate data or to visualize those same data. Those tools have increased in complexity, in richness, in capacity, and etc. But the people who use it are still here. You're still here. But what about everybody else? How can we bridge that epistemic gap? That's the purpose of How Charts Lie, and on the efforts that I'm putting on this in the past few years. Charts are useful. There's no doubt about that, right? If we think about a specific set of charts, data visualizations, the reason why they work so well is that the human brain, the normal human brain, has a very hard time understanding numbers, right? Understanding quantities. When we present data in tabular format, such as this one, a spreadsheet or a database or whatever, it is very, very hard for a normal human brain to answer questions based on the data presented in this format, and it's also very hard to spot patterns and trends in the data. But once we transform all these numbers, by the way, are average global temperatures in the past 1,000 years or so, from the year 1000 up to the year 2000, measured in Celsius degrees and compared to an average. That's the reason why you see positive and negative values in there. Whenever we present data like this, most people don't understand it. But when we map those data onto graphical properties of objects, that's the language that we use in data visualization, and we transform transform those numbers into some sort of chart, such as that one, the patterns and trends that hit in the data suddenly become more visible, more prominent. You cannot unsee them, right? And they become memorable. The data that I showed you before is the source for this graphic, which in my opinion is one of the most influential data visualizations designed in the 20th century. Is commonly called the hockey stick chart, which basically tells the story of global temperatures in the world maintaining themselves more or less stable for nearly 1,000 years, and then in the past 100 years or 150 years, suddenly global temperatures started spiking up very rapidly. That pattern, that trend in the data, the pattern in the data, that story that hid behind the numbers was invisible before when we presented the data in tabular format, in numerical form, but it suddenly becomes visible when we transform those numbers into a chart. Charts can be very persuasive. That's a very persuasive chart, right? We also have some evidence that showing that whenever we put a number or a series of numbers or a graphic or a map or whatever it is displaying data into any sort of piece of content, that piece of content suddenly becomes more persuasive, even if people don't pay attention to that number. The mere presence of numbers and the mere presence of charts in any piece of content makes that content more persuasive. Why? Well, researchers sort of have several conjectures. For example, they sort of conjecture that people tend to believe that numbers carry truth, or that numbers are objective, or that numbers are scientific. And we need to disabuse people from those opinions. Numbers can be very subjective. Numbers can be faulty, right? Numbers can be created in a wrong way, right? So numbers need to be, and the visuals that represent those numbers need to be closely scrutinized, and they need to be critically assessed. We also need to help people, right? What can you do and what can I do? We need to help everyone else, and perhaps even ourselves, start abandoning certain myths related to the world of data visualization. For example, the ever-present, a picture is worth 1,000 words. That's not true. A picture may be worth 1,000 words if you know how to read it. If you don't know how to read it, that picture will not be worth 1,000 words, as I will show you in just 1 minute. Second myth, visualizations are intuitive. That's not true either. Certain kinds of data visualizations are indeed intuitive. The bar graph, the line chart, very common kinds of graphic forms. Those are intuitive just because they have been around for more than 200 years, right? Therefore, they are part of the common language. But certain kinds of visualizations, certain kinds of charts that were invented more recently, those are not intuitive at all. In order to understand a visualization, we need to understand the symbols and the grammar of that visualization. If we don't understand the syntax, the grammar of that visualization, we will not understand it. Another myth, this is very common in the world of business analytics, based on my experience, data should speak for itself. Just show me the numbers. That is very dangerous, because numbers never speak for themselves, right? What really matters in data is not the data itself, it's the interpretations of those data, right? The meaning that we extract from those numbers, and data never speaks for itself. It needs to make it to confess to the things that we want to see. And the last one is very common in the worlds that I come from, the world of journalism and the world of graphic design. Show, don't tell. Well, no, we need to show and tell. We need to show and explain if we want people to understand what our graphics mean. That's an example of why these myths are untrue. This is a photograph that was taken in the White House back in 2017, in January 2017. As you remember, President Donald Trump won the 2016 presidential elections. That's not news, I guess. But what is news is that right after he took office, right after he entered the White House, he ordered some of his aides to print out a large map representing the results of the 2016 presidential election, frame that map, and then hang that map on the walls of the White House. And that's a photograph that was taken in the hallways of the White House, a person carrying that map about to be mounted, about to be hanged on the walls of the White House. As you may notice, the map is representing the results of the election at the county level. Red represents the counties that were won by President Trump, and blue represents the counties that were won by candidate Clinton. President Trump loves this map. There was an interview conducted by several reporters from Reuters, from the news organization, in the Oval Office, and these reporters, in the story that they wrote after the interview with President Trump, said that Trump had a huge pile of these maps, a printout of these maps, and he was giving copies of this map to whoever came to visit him in the Oval Office. This is an actual photograph that was taken during the interview with Trump explaining something, and then the 3 copies piece of the map on top of that. Now, that map, though, can be greatly misinterpreted, right? Can be very easily misinterpreted. There's nothing wrong with the map per se. The map is completely correct. There's nothing wrong with it. What is wrong with it is how the map is misinterpreted, because Trump loves this map so much, and people who support President Trump in the United States love this map so much, because the map, if you don't know how to read it well, conveys the idea of a victory by a landslide, because 80% of that map is covered in red, and 20% of that map is covered in blue. So it conveys the idea of a huge victory, right, of the Republican Party in the 2016 presidential election. But as you may remember, this map doesn't really represent the actual popular support that President Trump received in the 2016 election, right? The election was sort of 50-50, a 50-50 split. But that map, the problem with that map, again, is not the map itself. The map is completely right. It is only that the map was designed originally with a specific purpose in mind, which is to show who won where. That's what the map is for. But it's being reused to infer something different. What is the popular support for each one of these countries? For each one of these candidates? How many people voted for each one of these candidates? That map was not designed with that purpose. Therefore, that's a misuse of that map, right? The problem with using this map to show popular support, that 80-20%, is based on the fact that Republican vote tends to be very dispersed, tend to concentrate mostly in sparsely populated areas. Most of the counties that voted Republican on this map are rural counties. And Democratic vote tends to concentrate in big cities, densely populated areas, small areas, but very densely populated. That's a reality that is revealed on this map. This map designed by a cartographer called Ken Field shows the reality of the popular vote, of the popular support of each one of these candidates. On this map, there are more than 160 million dots. It's zoomable. Each one of those dots is colored according to whether that person, each dot obviously represents one voter, they are color-coded according to whether that person voted Republican or Democratic or for a third candidate, and then the dots are geolocated close to where these people voted. And that shows you the 50-50 split. On this map, there is more or less the same amount of red and the same amount of blue. And not only that, it also reveals the reality that nobody lives here, right? That area is empty, right? There are only cows and grass. And cows don't vote, right? Cows don't vote. People do. At least that's what we are told. Now, there are other ways to represent this data, to represent popular support, right? I'm not a very sophisticated cartographer, so I don't even know where to begin if I wanted to design something like that. But there are other ways to represent the popular support in a presidential election in the United States. For example, a simple bar graph, right? A simple bar graph can actually show you how many people voted for each one of the candidates. I'm going to move my cursor away, by the way, so we will not bother you. So President Trump got 46% of the vote. Candidate Clinton got 48% of the vote. So in terms of popular support, Hillary Clinton won the election. President Trump won the election legally because of the Electoral College. As you know, the United States is not a direct democracy, right? There is a two-step process in voting in a presidential election. But even this bar graph is not completely correct, right? It's not completely correct. Why? Because if you want to talk about popular support, or if you want to basically, print out a graphic and hang it on the walls of the White House to basically boast about the popular support that you have, you also need to consider not only the people who voted in the election, but also the people who could have voted and didn't vote for some reason, because you don't really know who those people would vote for if they could have voted or if they did have voted. The problem is that if you do that, then perhaps you will not want to hang anything on the walls of the White House anymore, because more than 40% of people didn't even vote. When I say people, by the way, I mean adults. 40% of adults in the United States didn't even vote in the 2016 presidential election, and actually President Trump received around 27-28% of the vote. This is the level of scrutinizing that I was mentioning before. Whenever we approach charts, or when we teach other people how to approach charts in a critical manner, in an informed manner, right? If we want to become better readers of charts, we need to pay attention to the chart. We cannot assume, and this is something that happens to everybody, I guess, it certainly happens to me, that whenever we talk to other people about charts, people tend to believe that charts are illustrations, right? They're just pictures. Well, they are not. A chart is not an illustration, a chart is not a picture, a chart is not an image. A chart is a visual argument. And in order to understand an argument, as a written argument, you need to pay attention to that particular argument that is being made to you. What is going on here? Well, we could go into the literature of user experience design, UX design. Whenever we design a visualization, we have a mental model. That's me designing that graphic, by the way. So we have a particular mental model of what that visualization is showing, right? You have an idea of how that map or how that graphic should work, the information that is supposed to convey, how it is built. That is the mental model at work, and then you put it on paper, or you put it on a screen. The problem is that in this equation, there's another person or other people in the equation. You also have the reader on the other side. And the reader, who I depicted with a little Sharpie in his hand, as you may notice, I'm not going to explain why, but in any case, the reader in this particular case may approach your visualization with a completely different mental model in mind. You are trying to represent in your map who won where, but then the reader comes to you interpreting that map as representing popular support, which is a completely different mental model. When mental models match, you have understanding happen. But when there is a mismatch between the mental models, then misunderstandings may happen. There is a third portion in this equation, by the way, and I will get back to it later on during the talk, the role of mediators. Who are mediators? Mediators are people, organizations, who are in between you, the designer, and the reader. People who can explain the content of a chart, or who could explain how to read that chart correctly. I will get to them in just 1 minute, and why they are so important, and what we can do ourselves as mediators whenever we present charts. So what to do? Well, there are several things that we can help with, or that we can do whenever we design a visualization, or when we talk to others about how visualizations or charts work. The first one is to encourage people to become more graphicate. What is graphicate? Well, graphicacy is basically a term that was invented 50 or 60 years ago to refer to visual or graphical literacy. This term appears in many different books, among them Mapping It Out by cartographer Marc Montmonier, although the term itself is much older than this book. So in Mapping It Out, by the way, Montmonier is also the author of a wonderful book titled How to Lie with Maps, which I really recommend to you. Anyway, so in Mapping It Out, Montmonier says that today, in order to educate citizens for democracies, we certainly need to keep teaching literacy, how to read and write, right? That's essential, obviously. But we also need to teach articulacy, which is the ability to express ourselves correctly verbally. And on top of that, we also need to teach numeracy. Now, what is numeracy? Numeracy is not exactly mathematics, and it is not exactly statistics, and it's not exactly data science. It is a combination of everything plus scientific thinking. Numeracy, the way that I envision it, is like some sort of mental alarm that starts ringing whenever you see a graphic or a number that looks dubious in news media, for example. You take a look, you're reading the newspaper online, and you see a number, and something inside of your brain starts ringing in the back of your mind saying, there is something dubious about this number, or there is something strange about this graphic. You don't know exactly what it is, but your brain is unconsciously telling you there is something wrong with it. Look closely, read it carefully, right? That's numeracy at work, and that's a sense that can be trained. And then on top of that, we have graphicacy, which is the ability to use and to read the graphics that depict those numbers or that complexity. On top of that, I would like to add another component to an ideal educational system, which is to educate awareness and educate attention. We are living in a culture of distraction. I'm not saying anything new, right? We are all distracted, we are all rushed, we all navigate and go through our Twitter streams very, very quickly without paying much more attention. We need to train ourselves and to curb that impulse, period, and help other people to do the same, to become more mindful about the information that we consume and also the information that we distribute. I will get back to that in just 1 minute. So, where can we find models or inspiration on how to teach graphicacy to other people? I would encourage you to look into the work of Hans Rosling, a professor of international health in Sweden, who sadly passed a couple of years ago. Before he passed, he published a wonderful book titled Factfulness. Hans Rosling, in my opinion, was one of the most effective presenters of data that I have ever seen. He could make data sing. You can see many of his presentations in his website, gapminder.org. York. And he also did a documentary for the BBC, for BBC4, a number of years ago, titled The Joy of Stats. A particular scene in that documentary gives you an idea of how he presented data. Let me just show you the video, and I'm going to talk on top of it. So Rosling appeared on his screen, and he said, I'm going to show you a graphic. First of all, I'm going to put here a vertical axis, and the vertical axis is lifespan of different countries. Several countries are going to appear. The horizontal axis corresponds to the average wealth of these countries. It's not actually the average wealth, it's the total, I think there's GDP per capita or something like that. So GDP per capita is the horizontal axis. So if you're down here, this country is poor and sick. If the country is up here, this country is very wealthy and also quite healthy. People tend to live quite long. So now I'm going to show you all these countries in 1810. Here are the countries, right? First of all, we have these countries and then these countries. The color corresponds to the continent that those countries belong to, as you may see. And then the size of the bubble is proportional to the population of these countries. And now I'm going to show you the data. And he starts describing the data. Now, what Rosling did at the beginning of this particular scene is not just to describe the content of the graphic that he was about to present. He was also trying to increase the level of graphicacy of his audience by, first of all, explaining the grammar of the graphic and the symbols that were used in the graphic. He was indirectly saying, here's how to read this graphic. This is scatter plot. Here's how to read a scatter plot. Now let me show you the scatter plot. That's how we increase graphicacy among our audiences, regardless of whether you are your managers in your company, the general public, friends and family, is to always try to show and tell, not to show, don't tell. Show and tell. Words really matter, right? That interpretation layer, we call that the annotation layer in visualization, the words that we put in a visualization, underneath the visualization, on top of the visualization, or the words that we speak when we present a visualization, those words really matter, and they are an intrinsic part of any sort of data visualization. Second recommendation is to encourage people to pay attention to where the data comes from. What is the source of the data, right? One of the rules that I describe in How Chats Lie is that if a visualization that you see in news media and social media doesn't include the source of the data, distrust it. Period. No doubt about that, right? But if the visualization discloses where the data comes from, it can really take you a long way to take a quick look at the primary source of the data, just to assess whether the graphic that you're seeing is actually measuring what it says that it's measuring, right? I'm going to tell you a very short story. A number of years ago, one of my best students from the University of Miami, Luis Melgar, he's also from Spain, and he lives now in Washington, D.C., he did his final project for my class about homelessness in Florida, particularly homelessness among students. How many primary education students in Florida are homeless, right? And he came to me with several visualizations that he designed. That's the title of his project. You can find it online, A School Without a Roof, number of homeless students in Florida. When I first saw these graphics, he showed me these graphics, I was completely shocked. I said, how is it possible that there are counties in Florida where 1 out of 5 students are homeless? 20% or more of the students in these counties are homeless, right? And he told me, well, you are misinterpreting this graphic because you are not considering how this source is defining a homeless person. The idea that I have a homeless person is someone who lives on the streets. That's how I have always defined a homeless person, but that's not how the state of Florida defines a homeless person. A homeless person, according to the state of Florida, the way that they define this metric, is anyone who doesn't have a permanent home, all right, or who has to switch his home 2 or 3 times a year, right? So if, for example, a young student, his or her fathers are divorced, all right, and this student needs to move from his father's house to his mother's house and then to an uncle's house or whatever 2 or 3 times every year, that student automatically is considered homeless, and he or she will appear on that chart over here. Now, does that mean that the data is bad? No, it just means that we need to understand what the data is actually measuring, and most people don't pay attention to that. Even ourselves sometimes. We don't pay attention at the definitions of the data. We don't scrutinize the data, and that can be really dangerous, right? Because it can lead us to stories such as this one. A while ago, Christopher Ingraham, who is a very famous reporter from the Washington Post, a good friend, a friend of mine, and very good reporter, he used to have a blog before he began working for the Washington Post, and he published that story titled, "Kansas is the nation's porn capital, according to Pornhub." As you may know, Pornhub is a porn website. in case you're interested for some reason. But in any case, so Pornhub publishes their data every year, right? And you can download it and explore it. And Chris downloaded that data and had some fun with the data, combining the data from Pornhub pages per capita, consumed per capita, in every state of the country, of the country, of the United States, and then he compared Pornhub consumption per capita, porn consumption per capita, against voting patterns. And he created a scatter plot like that. The horizontal axis is percentage of people on each state who voted for President Obama in 2012, and then the vertical axis is Pornhub page views per person in 2013. And as you may see, there is a very clear association in there, right? The more democratic a state is, the kinkier it is as well, the more porn it consumes on average, right? You may see that, right? Democratic states consume a lot of porn, right? The Republican states consume much less porn on average. And take a look at Kansas. Kansas is an outlier. What is going on with Kansas? Ha ha ha, right? That's so funny, right? Well, later on, Chris discovered that there was a glitch in the data, and he disclosed that. Chris is a very good reporter, a very good journalist, and as a good journalist, he's very transparent and also very willing to correct himself when he gets things wrong. We all get things wrong, right? What really matters is how often we correct ourselves. Actually, let me make an aside. That's a very good sign to identify a good journalist or a good news organization. News organizations, the more they correct themselves, right, the better usually they are. That's a very good proxy variable to understand or to identify good news sources. Anyway, so what was the glitch in the data? The glitch in the data was the following. So if you have a computer and you access Pornhub, right? Again, if you're interested. You access Pornhub, and Pornhub will identify your IP address, and Pornhub will be able to locate your IP address saying, well, this is someone who accesses Pornhub from Kendall, Florida, which is where I live, and they will put a dot in Kendall, Florida. We have one user in Kendall, Florida, point, right? So every data point is located like that. However, there's a glitch in the data. If you use a VPN, for example, they will not be able to identify where you come from. You could come from anywhere. You are basically just obscuring your IP address. Therefore, they will not locate you where you are. They will know that you are using a VPN. And what they will do will be what they did in the past, at least in 2013, Pornhub did, was to default your position to the center of the contiguous United States, the center of the country. Well, you are guessing where the center of the country is, right? It's in Kansas. It's in Kansas. So every user who was using Pornhub through a VPN was, by default, defaulted, located in a farm in Kansas over here, very close to the border of Nebraska. Again, probably nobody lives there. It's only cows and grass. And cows and grass don't vote, and they don't consume porn either, as far as I know. And I may be wrong with that, who knows? Anyway, so third thing out of 4 or 5, I think. We need to teach ourselves and teach other people to embrace depth, not to seek simplification. In the book, I go into great lengths at explaining what the difference is between simplifying things and clarifying things. There's a difference, right? I don't like to use the verb to simplify. I don't think that visualizations are intended to simplify data. They are intended to clarify data. Sometimes visualizations can be oversimplifications of data. This is an example. This is the murder rate in the United States from the year 1960 up to the year 2015 or 2016. As you may notice, the murder rate varied across the years. When we get to the present, the murder rate has started increasing again. If we extend this line up to the present, that line continues increasing. Now, if you don't know what lies behind this data, behind this chart, which, by the way, it's completely right. There's nothing wrong with the chart. The problem is how we interpret it. It's very easy to describe this chart as the United States is becoming a more dangerous country, right? That's not true. Why is it not true? Well, because most places in the United States, right, most cities, more towns, most neighborhoods, etc., if we could plot them on this vertical axis, they will be down there, right? Those are just a bunch of imaginary plots, each one of them representing a place in the United States, a city or a town. Most places in the United States have a very low murder rate. In my own neighborhood, there probably has been one murder in the past 5 or 6 years, something like that. It's a very safe neighborhood, right? And most places in the United States are like that. So why is the murder murder rate, the national murder rate, increasing because of extreme values, because of outliers. There are certain places in the United States that in the past 5 or 6 years have become so dangerous and so violent that they are skewing the national rate, right? They are sort of distorting the national rate. Now, what is the main takeaway? Well, whenever you are presenting data, don't simplify the data by just showing an aggregated measure, particularly when your distribution is very skewed. You need to show the distribution. And you may say, well, but my manager doesn't care about that complexity. Well, they should care. And if they don't care, it's your responsibility to make them care, because otherwise they will be misled. And as a journalist, I would tell journalists always, right, don't just report the average or the measure of central tendency or the national rate, etc., particularly when you have a case like that, because that is a simplification, but it is not information. It is misinformation. It only becomes information when you add a little bit more detail, right? You show the national rate, but then you say, well, you know, this increase that we are witnessing in the past few years is due mainly to these specific places in the United States, which you could map, show where they are, that are sort of skewing the national rate. We also need to become aware of our own biases. This is a very important one, right? There is a growing literature about cognitive biases, and such as the confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, and things like that. Probably you have read some of those books. What I have seen throughout the years, though, is that people who read this literature, those will be several books that deal with all these things, some of my favorites among all the literature about cognitive biases. But what I have seen is that it is much easier for most people, most of us, to identify cognitive biases in other people, not in ourselves, right? And that is dangerous, because that may lead you to think, as a data scientist or as a programmer, that you're as smarter than everybody else. And that's not the case. You are as stupid as everybody else. I know that firsthand. Right? I used to believe that I know about charts and that I know how to design a graphic, and this graphic that I'm designing, everybody's going to understand it because I am applying, very sound design principles to the design of this chart, and blah, blah, blah. And through observation, I have discovered that that's not true. That's a humbling experience, right? Very, very humbling experience. So we need to become more mindful. We need to become more attentive to the biases that may hinder our understanding of the data, because it is very easy to see in the charts that we see every day what we want to see, what we already want to see. Just an example that you can use to illustrate this problem with friends and family. Everybody will understand this. Let's suppose, for some reason, just for the sake of argument, that you're a cigarette smoker. You smoke a lot of cigarettes every day. You shouldn't do that. It's really bad for your health. But let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, that you smoke a lot. And family, friends, acquaintances, they tell you every day, you should stop smoking. Smoking is going to shorten your life. It's probably you're very likely to develop cancer at some point, right? The probability of getting a bad disease because of smoking increases through smoking and blah, blah, blah. And you have grown tired of hearing people telling you that, just because you like smoking. You're stressed out, you want to smoke, and smoking makes you feel calmer. And suddenly one day, I showed you a chart that corroborates that the more we smoke, the longer we live. That chart over there. That chart, there's nothing wrong with it, right? With the chart itself. The data is sound. The data comes from the World Bank. It comes from the United Nations, right? And it shows, as you can see, it's a scatter plot that is showing that there is a positive association between cigarette consumption per capita per country. Each one of those is a country. Position on the horizontal axis is annual cigarette consumption. And then the vertical axis is life expectancy. Again, it is very easy to describe the content of this chart as the more we smoke, the longer we live. But that is wrong. And I have made this description myself. Why is it wrong? Because this chart is not showing that the more we smoke, the longer we live, or that the more I smoke, the longer I will live. All that the chart is showing, and this is why it's so important to scrutinize a chart and read it carefully, is that there is a positive association indeed between cigarette consumption, life expectancy, and vice versa. But that doesn't really mean that those two facts or those two variables are connected to each other at all. There may be other many factors that contribute to this association, and patterns that you see at the national level may not exist at the individual level, which is the level that you care about. You want to learn about yourself, not about country averages like we are displaying over here, right? Once we start disaggregating the data by wealth, for example, we will discover that wealth is a variable that is connected to both cigarette consumption and life expectancy. The wealthier a country is, and the wealthier people in those countries are on average, the more cigarettes they can buy and they can consume, right? We know that. And that shortens lifespans on average. But at the same time, people who live in wealthy nations, right? Wealthy nations need to be safer. They tend to have better health care. They tend to have better services in general, and that increases life expectancy. So the life expectancy that we are losing for bad habits is compensated somehow by the fact that we have better health cares. Once we disaggregate the countries by wealth, as you can see, if we separate these countries by different income levels, wealth levels or income levels, I don't remember what I use here anyway. Doesn't really matter that much. So you can see that the association disappears. It vanishes completely. And I know that if we could disaggregate the data further, for example, regions in those countries, cities in these countries, blocks in these countries, down to the individual level, the positive association that we saw before, more cigarettes, more life expectancy, reverses. The more we smoke, the shorter we tend to live. If we take a look at survival curve rates, such as this one, charts that show, on average, how many years people who smoke and people who don't smoke tend to live, on average, you may see that the curve for people who smoke tends to drop much faster than the curve of people who don't smoke at all or who stopped smoking 10 years ago or more. This example that I have just shown you is great to explain to sort of average people like me, things that really usually hinder understanding of complex data sets such as this one. For example, amalgamation paradoxes or Simpson's paradox. A Simpson's paradox is basically a pattern that you see at a certain level of aggregation of data may disappear or even reverse at lower or higher levels of aggregation. And connected to that, the ecological fallacy. If you want to learn something about yourself, it is very dangerous to take a look just at data aggregated at the national level. You need to look at data aggregated at the level that you want to learn about, the individual level, that level over here. The national level of aggregation may be useful for other purposes, I don't know, but it's certainly not useful if you want to learn something about yourself. But it is very easy, again, to describe the original chart as the more we smoke, the longer we live. And that is dangerous. The descriptions that we come up with, the verbal descriptions that we come up with of the visualizations that we see every day, I tend to believe that they may bias our understanding of the graphics that we see. Final point, why does all this matter? Because of an ethical concern, right? I'm very, very concerned about ethics, morality. How should we behave in the world out there? So I'm going to circle back to the diagram that I showed you at the very beginning of the talk, this diagram over here. In the past, 20, 30 years ago, most of us were usually mere readers or users of charts, right? Somebody else designed those charts. They put those charts in there were no social media 20 years ago. In newspapers, magazines, or whatever, right? They put those graphics in there. And we were consumers of those graphics, right? Sort of passive receivers of those graphics. However, right, and in the past also, the burden of responsibility for creating good charts and for distributing good charts was put mostly on the platforms who carry those charts, newspapers, magazines, and so on and so forth, and also on professional mediators, right? For example, journalists. The responsibility for readers to understand graphics was the designer's responsibility, and journalists' responsibility to explain what those graphics meant. What is the problem, though? That today, nowadays, all of us are journalists, all of us, in the following sense. What is a journalist? A journalist is simply a person who, due to a sense of service to society, we gather information, we filter information, we transform that information, and then we try to present that information clearly to the public. Ideally, that's what a good journalist should do, right? Now, that third goal, or that third purpose, the dissemination of information, that is not a task that journalists alone do anymore. Now everybody does these, all of us do these, just because we all have access to social media, and we can all create a blog to spread our information or to spread our ideas or our opinion. We can all go online and start talking about the charts and the graphs and the maps that we see every day. This is a great power. And as the original Spider-Man movie used to say, with great power comes great responsibility. So if there is just one idea that I would like you to take home here today, is that stop retweeting things mindlessly, right? I have done this. I see a chart that confirms what I already believe, and I know how easy to say, yeah, this is so great, and you retweet it. Let's not do, or you post it on Facebook or on Instagram or any other sort of social media platform. We need to curb that impulse because we are all responsible for creating good informational environments. I am a great believer in the fact that tech companies also have a responsibility on this, so I am not saying that Facebook, Twitter, whatever, they don't have a responsibility to stop the spread of misinformation. They do have a responsibility, but sometimes in the discussions about misinformation, we forget the fact that all of us are also sort of like accomplices in the spread of misinformation, and we can do much better. How? If we pay attention, if we read the sources, if we read charts more carefully, and as a result of that, we only help spread and we only help to promote charts that actually show good information. Thank you so much. Oh, while I wait for questions, by the way, before I forget, I'm going to show you my Twitter. Oh, sorry, can we bring back the slide, my computer? Como quieres. Yes. All right, so that's the tweet that I'm about to send, all right? While we, they're telling me that we are not going to have questions.
Yeah,
right?
we're going to pass the questions over because now Alberto is going to be in the Ask the Expert space. So if you want to have a specific conversation, that's a great place to go, where the comfy couches, the comfy sofas are, and also book signing, if anybody would like to get that done. So, muchas gracias.
Gracias por,
Thank you very
gracias
much.
por invitarme. Thank you so much.